So we've learned about sedimentary rocks accumulating in these different depositional environments and how they all have different characteristics. And you remember sedimentary rocks form these nice layers. Now we need to take a look at the study of stratigraphy, which is the study of those rock layers. And this includes every aspect of those sedimentary rock layers, including the lithology, which is the rock type. You know, is it sandstone? Is it gypsum? Is it limestone? The age of it, and correlation. Correlation is comparing these rock layers to surrounding ones, and anything else that's an important characteristic of that layer of sedimentary rock. Now there are some basic rules in stratigraphy. You should be familiar with all of these. For instance, Steno's principles. Remember, superposition, the oldest are at the bottom, they get progressively younger to the top. Original horizontality, where sedimentary rocks are originally horizontal. Lateral continuity, where they extend in all directions until they thin to nothing. And you should also remember your unconformities. An unconformity is one of these surfaces that represents the gap in the rock record. So basically, we're missing rocks from a certain time period. And if we are studying this sequence of a layer of rocks, we need to know if something is missing from there. So it's very important to be able to identify those unconformities. Now, why would something be missing from this stack of rocks? Well, you could have had erosion, right? So erosion occurred and wore away, weathered away some rock that originally was there. Or you could simply have non-deposition, meaning there was a time period where nothing was deposited. So you are missing rocks from that particular time. Now there are three basic types of unconformities. You have the angular unconformity, like what we see here, where the rocks below the unconformity are at an angle to the rock above. So right here is the unconformity, and those rocks are at an angle to these. All right, that's our angular unconformity. You also have the non-conformity, and this is where, right here is our unconformity. The rocks under the unconformity are intrusive igneous or metamorphic rocks, the kinds of rocks that form deep, deep underground. And the rocks sitting on that unconformity are sedimentary rocks that form at Earth's surface. In this case, our unconformity is right here. These rocks are Lewisian gneiss. Remember, gneiss is metamorphic. And these rocks above are Torridonian sandstone, your sedimentary rock. You can also have what's called a disconformity. Disconformities are the most difficult ones to recognize because they occur between parallel layers of sedimentary rock. So you actually have to look very closely to see a surface of erosion or have age dates that let you know the rocks are from different time periods. So this is the Grand Canyon. In the Grand Canyon, we have a few different unconformities. There is a non-conformity at the bottom here. This is the Vishnu schist, and then there's a sandstone sitting on top of it. So that would be a non-conformity. But somewhere in here, there's also a disconformity. I just have trouble finding it because, again, it's between layers of parallel sedimentary rock. So without actually getting in there and taking a close look at them, I can't tell you exactly where it is. All right, another important thing to remember when you are dealing with stratigraphy, studying these layers of rock, is formations. A formation is a distinctive, mappable rock unit that you can easily distinguish from surrounding rock units. So it's something that formed in a distinctive environment, you can definitely set it apart from things around it. And when we're talking about these rock units, we might be talking about what's called a lithostratigraphic unit. And that's a body of rock with distinctive physical features. So the rock type, the color, the sedimentary structures, things like that. And you can see that right here. Here we have a series of distinctive lithostratigraphic units. For example, this one right here looks very different from what's below it and what's above it because it has distinctive physical characteristics. But you can also have what are called chronostratigraphic units. And you'll see these sometimes referred to as time rock units. This is a body of rock deposited or emplaced at a particular time. So it might not be the same physically, right? It might have some different physical characteristics, but it was deposited at exactly the same time. And the way you can look at this is picture like at a coastal area. Right close to the beach, you tend to have sandstone. Then as you get into a little deeper water, you have like shale being formed, and then a little deeper water than that, limestone. All of those rocks are being formed at the same time. So that would be a chronostratigraphic unit, even though they're not the same type of rock. The lithostratigraphic would be sandstone, shale, limestone. So just make sure you know the difference between a body of rock deposited at the same time versus a body of rock that has exactly the same characteristics. So that's our lithostratigraphic versus chronostratigraphic units. Now, typically your rock formations are going to be lithostratigraphic. They're going to be based on physical characteristics, and these get specific names. And how the rock gets its name is usually the geography plus the rock type. For example, earlier I pointed out this rock here. That is the Navajo Formation. Now, how to get that, or Navajo sandstone, I should say. Now, how to get that name? Well, it's a sandstone, so rock type, and where it was first described and identified in detail was on the Navajo Nation. So, geography, Navajo Nation, the rock type, it's a sandstone, so it gets called the Navajo Sandstone. One of the rocks near there is called the Kayenta Formation. Well, where it was first described was near Kayenta, Arizona. And it's a mix of both sandstone and siltstone and shale. So it's not really one rock type in general, so we just say formation because it's a mix of a few rock types. So that's how they get their names. Now, formations might be made of members and be part of a larger group. So for example, here at the Dolores River again, down here, this is the Chinle Formation. But within that Chinle Formation are these like smaller groups or smaller units of rock called members. So you might have the petrified forest member, the church rock member that are unique within that formation. But then sometimes these formations get lumped into a bigger group called a group. And you would see that right up here. This is called the Glen Canyon Group, which includes things like the Navajo Sandstone and the Kayenta Formation, and a few other formations in there. So these are just some of those rules of stratigraphy, but for you guys, one of the most important things to remember is the basic stratigraphic unit that you will see most commonly is the rock formation. All right, this also brings me to something called facies. And facies are a part of a body of rock that has unique characteristics from which you can infer the depositional environment. And you can have lithofacies, where the distinctive characteristics are lithologic, meaning rock type, or you can have biofacies, where you have a distinctive fossil assemblage. So for example, in this diagram, we have the continent right here, and then we have the kind of the beach, and we're going into deeper water. And so we have this sand and silt facies, so that's where we have a lot of sand and siltstone. Then we have this area where shale is accumulating. Then we have this area where like limestone or carbonate rocks. And so those would be the lithofacies, right? The environments of formation based on the rock type. However, you might also end up having biofacies, where we're looking at fossils. So for instance, there might be some fossils that live in areas from about here to about here. That's two different rock types, but that's the region where that particular fossil is forming or is living, and so that would be our biofacies. Facies can shift over time. And this is particularly noticeable in coastal areas where we have sea level changes. Because imagine if sea level falls, right, this sand facies is going to move this way. If sea level rises, it's going to move that way. So these facies, in response to environmental things like sea level change, can shift around over time. So let's talk about sea level change, because that's one thing as we go forward in historical geology, it's one of the big themes that we're going to see is that sea level is always rising and falling, and those rises and falls of sea level greatly influence Earth's history. So with sea level change, we can have a transgression, and a transgression is the migration of the strand line onto the craton. Okay, strand line, that's where the water is, right? That's the edge of the ocean. You can think the beach. The craton, remember, that's the stable part of the continent. So a transgression is where water is rising and moving onto the continent. And a regression is where sea level is falling and moving off the craton. These sea level changes result in unique sequences of rock. You can have what's called an onlap sequence, which is where the transgression is occurring and you get the finer grained sediments on top of coarser ones. Or you can have an offlap sequence where the coarser ones are on top of the finer ones because you have a regression. Let's take a look at what I mean by that. So in geology, you're going to have to learn these symbols. Dots means sandstone, dashes means like siltstone or shale, and bricks means limestone. So limestone tends to form in shallow or deeper environments. Sandstone tends to form in those shallower beach environments. So what we're seeing here in this transgression, the water's moving that way, so all these facies are shifting that way. So notice sandstone, which is coarser, now has this shale, which is finer grained, sitting on top of it. That tells us sea level is rising because we're getting those deeper water deposits on top of the shallower water ones. The regression is the opposite, right? In this case, we have the deeper water deposits, then the coarser grained, shallower ones on top of that. That tells us sea level is falling. So you can actually look at these stacks of sediment on top of each other and be able to tell, did we have a sea level rise at that time or did we have a regression at that time? And this is simply another image showing you the same thing where basically sea level rise and fall going on. And so this really results in Walther's law, which states that sedimentary facies that are deposited laterally next to each other can be stacked on top of each other in response to sea level change. So you can see the deeper water facies deposited on top of the shallower water facies because sea level changed. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, right? They're laterally next to each other, but they can also be on top of each other. That's Walther's law. Now, sea level change results then in great environmental change. In the past, I know I've said this before in this class, Texas was at least in part covered by sea level 6 times in Earth's history. Well, that would be a really big environmental change, right? Just think about where you are living would be underwater. And these big sea level changes, just how much could they be? Let me give you a couple of examples. During the last glacial maximum, so the last time that glaciers had grown to their maximum extent, the Atlantic shoreline was 100 to 200 kilometers east of where it is today. So, you know, like New York City sits right on the coast. Well, if we would go back to the last glacial maximum, we'd have to drive like 200 kilometers from there to reach the beach. In fact, let's see, today, where water is 100 meters deep off the Atlantic coast, that would have been dry land back in the last glacial maximum. If all the ice melted today, sea level would rise about 30 meters. That would mean Houston would pretty much be underwater. But if you live kind of in western Harris County or Montgomery County, you would probably be on kind of you might have beachfront property if all of the ice melted. Now, ice is not the only thing that controls sea level. Small scale sea level changes are controlled by just how much glacial ice we have. Large-scale sea level changes, so even bigger than this, the kind that flood entire parts of continents, that's controlled by plate tectonics. In particular, it's controlled by how fast sea floor spreading is happening. All right, so large-scale sea level changes, that's caused by the seafloor spreading, and if seafloor spreading happens really, really fast, it actually displaces, it pushes up sea level, and creates what are called epicontinental or epiric seas. Now, these are synonyms. I tend to use epicontinental more, but I just want you to be able to know, depending what textbook you have, these words mean the same thing. So these epicontinental seas are shallow seas that cover large parts of continents. And these major changes in sea level, the sea level rise and fall, create what are called unconformity-bounded sequences. So let's explain what these unconformity-bounded sequences are. These are large, laterally extensive rock units that can include many, many formations. So what basically happens is we get sea level rising to the point where it covers like half of North America. Well, as sea level rises, it's going to be, sediments are going to be deposited. So you're going to get a whole bunch of different rock formations being deposited. Now, why do we get them bounded by unconformities? Weathering and erosion happens above sea level. So when we have sea level rise, we get lots of sediment deposited, but then as the sea level regresses and falls, all of that is exposed to weathering and erosion, so a lot of it can get eroded away, creating an unconformity, a huge regional unconformity as that sea level regressed, as it dropped again. And so these unconformity-bounded sequences are going to be these packages of sedimentary rocks in between two large-scale unconformities, and these unconformities can be continent-wide. And in fact, these sequences are recognized globally. We can see these unconformity-bounded sequences on every continent. And what kind of sea level changes are we talking about? And these are approximate numbers. They vary from approximately 200 meters lower than today to at least 350 meters higher than today. So sea level can have some very significant changes. So let's look at this diagram because this shows our unconformity-bounded sequences. What we're seeing here is the past 600 million years of Earth history. And these are the time periods. You might recognize some of them, like Jurassic, right? And what we're seeing here, there's present-day sea level, and these are showing you the transgression, and then here's that unconformity, right? That's where the sea level dropped and eroded lots of the rocks. So transgression, and then this unconformity formed by regression. Then another transgression and another regression. And there's those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that I was talking about that have covered the state of Texas, at least partially, in the past. Now, what these letters stand for, each one of these sequences has a name, and later on in the semester we'll talk about what each of those names refers to.